They often say that silence is golden. But sometimes, silence is the roar of a gathering storm, the eerie calm before justice finds its own way. It is the silence of a heart that has endured too much, and when it finally decides to speak, the whole world will have to listen. In the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York City, surrounded by the gentle clinking of crystal and the low hum of 1,000 quiet conversations, this particular silence was born. Eleanor Vance stood near a marble pillar, a solitary island in a sea of silk and diamonds. The dress she wore was the nicest she had ever owned, a simple navy sheath that had cost her 2 weeks' wages. But in this room, it felt like a whisper against a symphony of extravagance. Her hands, clasped nervously in front of her, were clean and neat, but they were the hands of a woman who had worked, truly worked, her entire life. They were a map of sacrifice, etched with the fine lines of scrubbing floors and serving meals to build a better life for her only child. And there she was, across the room, her daughter, Amelia, or rather, Amelia de Clare. She was a vision, sculpted by wealth and status, her laughter echoing like a delicate bell as she leaned into her husband, Julian. Beside them, the matriarch, Beatrice de Clare, watched over the scene with the possessive gaze of a queen surveying her domain. For a moment, Eleanor's heart swelled with a painful, complicated pride. This was the life she had wanted for Amelia, a life free from the struggles she had known. Gathering all her courage, she navigated the glittering crowd, her steps soft and hesitant. She just wanted a moment, a simple acknowledgement, a shared smile. She reached her daughter's side, her voice barely audible above the string quartet. Amelia, darling. The name, spoken with a lifetime of love, hung in the air for a fraction of a second before it froze. Amelia turned, her perfectly composed face shifting from polite amusement to a mask of cold, hard glass. She looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her, from the sensible shoes to the hopeful, loving eyes, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through her gaze. Then, it was gone. She turned slightly to the couple they were speaking with, a faint, dismissive smile on her lips. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "Do you know this woman?" "I certainly don't." The words were not shouted. They were spoken calmly, with the casual cruelty of swatting away an insect. For Eleanor, the world stopped. The music warped into a discordant noise, the glittering lights blurred into streaks of painful brightness. The only sound she could hear was the splintering of her own heart, a violent internal crack that made no outward sound. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. She was a stranger, a nobody, denied by her own flesh and blood. Without another word, Eleanor Vance turned and walked away, her back stooping under a weight far heavier than years of labor. She disappeared into the crowd, a ghost leaving a feast, her soul cloaked in a new, profound, and dangerous silence. That cold, marble ballroom, with its heartless glitter and silent judgments, was a universe away from the life Eleanor had so carefully and painfully built. It was a life measured not in carats or square footage, but in scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the persistent scent of lemon-scented cleaner that clung to her clothes like a second skin. To understand the depth of the wound inflicted by 4 simple words, "I don't know this woman," one must first understand the world that was built on the foundation of 2 words: my daughter. Eleanor Vance had been a widow for longer than she had been a wife. Her husband, a kind man with a laugh that could fill a room, was taken by a sudden illness when Amelia was just 3 years old, leaving Eleanor with a mountain of grief, a trickle of income, and a tiny, curious human being who depended on her for everything. Their world became a small, 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Astoria, Queens. It was a place where the radiators hissed and clanked in the winter, and the summer sun baked the tar paper roof, but to them, it was a fortress of love. Eleanor's life became a tapestry woven from double shifts and exhaustion. She was a waitress at a 24-hour diner, where the smell of stale coffee and bacon grease permeated her hair. She was a cleaner for a downtown office building, her nights spent under the ghostly glow of fluorescent lights, erasing the day's smudges from the lives of people she would never meet. She took on extra work, mending clothes for neighbors, typing papers for college students, anything that would add a few more dollars to the jar she kept hidden in the back of her closet. Every dollar was a choice: a new pair of sensible shoes for herself, or the ballet lessons Amelia dreamed of, a warmer coat for the brutal New York winter, or the set of encyclopedias Amelia coveted. For Eleanor, it was never a choice. The encyclopedias were purchased on an installment plan, and Eleanor learned to line her old coat with newspaper. She would come home long after Amelia was asleep, her muscles screaming in protest, and she would quietly check on her daughter, her heart aching with a love so fierce it felt like a physical presence in the room. This was her purpose, her religion, her entire existence. And Amelia, in her youth, was the sun around which Eleanor's weary planet orbited. She was a bright, inquisitive child, with her father's laugh and a determination that was all her own. She absorbed everything Eleanor provided with a fierce gratitude. She excelled in school, her report cards a source of immense pride that Eleanor would show to anyone who would listen. They were a team. Their evenings were a sacred ritual. After a simple dinner of pasta or soup, they would sit at the small, wobbly kitchen table, Amelia tackling her homework while Eleanor painstakingly mended a tear in a customer's dress. They would talk about everything and nothing: the mean girls at school, the plot of a book Amelia was reading, the dreams of a future that seemed as distant and shimmering as the Manhattan skyline from their window. Eleanor didn't just provide for Amelia's physical needs, she nurtured her soul. She took her to free museum days, to the library every Saturday, and packed picnics for them to eat in the park, creating a childhood rich in experience, even if it was poor in material possessions. Amelia saw the sacrifice. As a child, she saw it with the unfiltered clarity that adults often lose. She saw the new lines of fatigue etched around her mother's eyes. She saw how her mother would always claim to be not hungry when there was only enough for one full plate. And she promised, with all the fervent sincerity a child can muster, that it would all be worth it. Eleanor remembered one evening with a clarity that now felt like a curse. Amelia, then 12, had just won the citywide spelling bee. The final word was chrysanthemum. Eleanor had spent weeks quizzing her, writing the words on flashcards with her tired, aching hands. As a celebration, Eleanor splurged on 2 scoops of ice cream from the corner store. They sat on their front stoop, the city lights beginning to twinkle around them. Amelia, holding her small trophy, looked at her mother's hands, noticing the raw, red knuckles. She reached out and traced the lines with her small finger. "Mom," she said, her voice serious, "I'm going to make you so proud. One day, I'm going to be so successful that I'll buy you a beautiful house with a big garden, and you'll never have to scrub another floor or carry another heavy tray ever again. You can just read books and drink tea all day. I promise. I will never, ever forget everything you've done for me." Eleanor had pulled her into a fierce hug, her eyes welling with tears. That promise became her fuel. It was the memory she summoned during the longest nights, the thought that warmed her on the coldest mornings. It was the validation that every sacrifice was a stone being laid on the path to her daughter's bright future. She never wanted the house or the easy life for herself. The promise itself was enough. It was the proof of their bond, a bond she believed to be unbreakable, forged in hardship and sealed with love. She believed it was the one, true, unchangeable thing in her life. It was this memory, this sacred promise, that echoed in the silent, cavernous space of her heart as she walked away from the grand ballroom. The girl who had promised her a house with a garden had become a woman who refused to even know her name. The bond hadn't just been broken, it had been erased, publicly and brutally, leaving Eleanor to wonder if that loving, grateful child had ever truly existed at all. The path to the gilded cage was paved with the very promises that were meant to lead to freedom. It began, as Eleanor had always dreamed, with a scholarship. Amelia, with her sharp mind and relentless ambition, had earned a full ride to Columbia University. For Eleanor, seeing her daughter walk through those prestigious gates was the culmination of every sacrifice, the first glimpse of the promised land. For Amelia, it was like stepping into another dimension. The campus was a world of effortless privilege, where surnames were legacies and trust funds were as common as textbooks. It was here, in a seminar on post-war American literature, that she first met Julian de Clare. He wasn't just a student, he was an institution. He carried his family name, not with arrogance, but with an easy, unthinking certainty, the way other people carry their own skin. He was handsome, charming, and possessed a quiet confidence that Amelia, who was constantly battling the feeling that she was an imposter, found intoxicating. Julian was immediately drawn to Amelia's fire. She wasn't like the other girls in his circle, who had been bred for bland perfection. Amelia had an opinion, a hunger to learn, and a beauty that was vibrant and real, not curated. He pursued her with a casual, confident grace that left her breathless. He didn't send flowers. He had a rare orchid delivered to her dorm room. He didn't ask her to the movies. He invited her to a private gallery opening in Soho. Each date was a gentle, deliberate immersion into his world, a world that operated on a different set of rules. Amelia found herself falling, not just for the man, but for the life he represented. It was a life without worry, a life of beauty and access, a life where doors simply opened. The name de Clare was a key, and the kingdom it unlocked was ruled by a formidable queen, Beatrice de Clare. Amelia first heard of her through Julian's reverent, slightly fearful anecdotes. When she finally met her, it was not a warm introduction, but an audition. Beatrice had summoned them for Sunday brunch at the family's Fifth Avenue apartment, a sprawling residence that looked more like a wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art than a home. Beatrice was a woman carved from ice and steel, dressed in a cashmere twinset, the color of a winter sky. Her politeness was a weapon. She asked Amelia about her studies, her background, her family, and each question was a finely calibrated probe designed to measure her worth. When Amelia, trying to be honest, mentioned her mother worked in hospitality, Beatrice offered a thin, knowing smile. "Ah, service," she'd murmured, as if commenting on a quaint, forgotten craft. In that one word, Amelia felt the entirety of her mother's life of back-breaking labor be reduced to a footnote. Initially, Beatrice made her disapproval clear to Julian in private. The girl was bright, yes, and beautiful, but her bloodline was a void. She had no connections, no social standing. She was, in Beatrice's eyes, a liability. But Julian, for the first time in his life, was insistent. And Beatrice, ever the strategist, changed her tactics. If she could not get rid of the girl, she would remake her. She began to take Amelia under her wing, a process that felt less like mentorship and more like a slow, systematic erasure. It began with suggestions. A trip to Bergdorf's to find her a few suitable things, because her current wardrobe was, Beatrice noted, perfectly adequate for campus. Lessons with an etiquette coach were arranged to polish her raw edges. Beatrice would correct her posture at dinner, subtly guide her to the right fork, and critique her choice of words. Each lesson was delivered with the guise of kindness, but each one was a small cut, severing Amelia from the person she used to be. The poison of shame began to seep into Amelia's soul. The small, warm apartment in Astoria, once her sanctuary, now seemed cramped and shabby in her memory. The clothes her mother lovingly picked out for her from discount stores felt cheap and coarse. The phone calls home became a source of anxiety. She would be sitting in Julian's convertible, on their way to a weekend at the Hamptons, when her mother would call, full of excitement about a successful bake sale at her church. The chasm between their two realities was vast and growing, and Amelia started to resent being reminded of the side she was so desperate to leave behind. One weekend, she made an excuse not to come home, claiming she had to study for midterms. In reality, she was on a private jet to Street Bart's. She saw photos online of her mother at a neighborhood block party, smiling, and felt a pang of something ugly and unfamiliar. Embarrassment. The breaking point, the moment the shame crystallized into active betrayal, came during her junior year. Julian invited her to a de Clare family dinner with some important business associates. A jovial older gentleman, a potential investor, asked Amelia what her father did. Before she could answer, Julian, with a smooth, protective smile, interjected. Amelia's father passed away. He was a brilliant academic, a history professor, a great mind. Amelia froze. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Her father had been a construction worker, a good, honest, hard-working man who died because of faulty scaffolding on a non-union job site. But in that room, surrounded by immense power and wealth, the truth felt small and dirty. Julian squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity. And Amelia, feeling the weight of Beatrice's expectant gaze, simply smiled and nodded. She let the lie stand. In that moment, she chose the gilded cage. She chose the fantasy of a respected academic father over the reality of her honest, working-class one. It was a small betrayal, but it was the first, and it made all the ones that followed infinitely easier. The courtship culminated in a proposal as grand and impersonal as the Declare legacy itself. At the annual hospital benefit gala that Beatrice chaired, Julian got down on one knee, presenting a diamond that seemed to hold all the light in the room. The applause was thunderous. The photographer's flashes were blinding. It was a fairy tale. Amelia, weeping with what she told herself was joy, said yes. She was going to be Mrs. Amelia Declare. She had arrived. Eleanor saw the announcement in the society pages of the newspaper, a small, grainy photo of her daughter and a man she had never met. Amelia had called her the next day, her voice distant and rushed, talking about the wedding, the plans, the whirlwind she was caught in. She didn't mention the lie about her father. She didn't apologize for the growing distance. She was already speaking a different language, living in a different world. And as Eleanor stared at the picture of her smiling, radiant daughter, she couldn't shake the chilling feeling that she wasn't just looking at a bride-to-be, but at a beautiful stranger she was beginning to lose forever. The wedding was a masterpiece of public relations, an affair so opulent it was spoken of in hushed, envious tones for months. Amelia, in a gown that cost more than Eleanor's apartment building, was the perfect bride. She played her part flawlessly. But once the last champagne flute was cleared and the thank you notes were sent, the reality of her new life began. Being a Declare was not a status. It was a full-time occupation, and Beatrice was her direct supervisor. The gilded cage had soft velvet linings, but its bars were cold, hard steel. Amelia learned to dress, speak, and even think in a way that would bring honor to the Declare name. Her own identity, the girl from Queens who loved library books and street cart pretzels, was being systematically buried under layers of couture and expectation. Her past was not a source of strength, but a stain to be managed, and the most visible evidence of that past was her mother. Beatrice, with the cunning of a seasoned chess master, saw Eleanor not just as a social embarrassment, but as an untapped asset. One sun-drenched afternoon, as she and Amelia were having tea on the penthouse terrace overlooking Central Park, Beatrice made her first move. She placed her porcelain cup down with a delicate click. "Amelia, darling," she began, her voice a silken purr. "Julian and I have been so worried about your mother. She's worked so hard her entire life. A woman of her resilience deserves to enjoy her golden years, not to worry about every penny." Amelia tensed, expecting a lecture. Instead, Beatrice leaned in, her expression one of deep, manufactured concern. "The Declare Corporation is about to break ground on our most exclusive project yet, the Elysian Towers. The initial investment phase is strictly for family and our most trusted partners. The returns are, well, they're life-changing. We were thinking, what if we could extend an opportunity to your mother? It would be our gift, a way to welcome her into the family, truly, to ensure her future is as bright as yours." The proposition was presented not as a cold transaction, but as an act of profound generosity. It was brilliant, insidious, and it worked perfectly. For Amelia, it was a solution to a problem she couldn't articulate. The guilt she felt over neglecting her mother could be assuaged, not with time or attention, but with money. She could provide for her mother in the Declare way. More importantly, it was a chance to finally prove herself to Beatrice, to show that she was not just a taker, but a contributor to the family's legacy. She embraced the idea with the fervor of a convert, convincing herself it was the noblest thing she could possibly do. She was no longer just abandoning her past, she was elevating it. Armed with a glossy, leather-bound prospectus and a heart full of self-righteous conviction, Amelia drove to Queens. The moment she stepped out of the Blacktown car, the contrast was jarring. The old neighborhood, which once felt like home, now seemed gray and small. The familiar scent of her mother's apartment, a mix of bleach and cinnamon, which used to be comforting, now smelled of poverty. Eleanor was overjoyed to see her, her face lighting up with a love so pure it made Amelia momentarily uncomfortable. She hugged her daughter, feeling the unfamiliar stiffness of a $1,000 blazer. After a few minutes of strained small talk, Amelia placed the prospectus on the worn kitchen table, its sleek cover a stark alien object in the humble room. "Mom," she began, her voice echoing the practiced, confident tones of her husband. "I have the most wonderful news. Julian and Beatrice want to help you. They see how hard you've worked, and they want you to have the retirement you deserve." She launched into her speech, reciting phrases about projected growth, asset diversification, and exclusive access. She pointed to architectural renderings of gleaming glass towers, promising a future where Eleanor would never have to worry about money again. Eleanor listened patiently, her brow furrowed. She looked at the complicated charts and the fine print, but more than that, she looked at her daughter. She saw a stranger wearing Amelia's face, speaking a language of wealth she didn't understand. "Amelia, honey," Eleanor said softly, pushing the book aside. "This is very impressive. But this is your world, not mine. The money I have, it's not investment money. It's my safety net. It's for a new roof if this one starts leaking, for a doctor if I get sick. It's everything." Amelia's pleasant facade began to crack. She hadn't expected resistance. "Mom, that's scarcity thinking," she said. The condescending phrase, one she'd picked up from Beatrice. "This isn't a risk, it's a guarantee. It's the declare name. You have to think bigger." "I'm thinking about what's real," Eleanor countered, her voice steady. "I have to be careful." Seeing that logic was failing, Amelia shifted her strategy to emotion, the one weapon she knew her mother was defenseless against. Her eyes welled with tears, a performance she had perfected under Beatrice's tutelage. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to finally pay you back for everything. I thought you'd be happy for me, proud of me. Don't you trust me? Don't you trust my husband, my new family?" The words twisted in Eleanor's gut. This was no longer about money. It was a loyalty test. Amelia pressed her advantage. "This is our chance to be a real family, for you to be a part of my life. Or you can stay here, clinging to your old fears, and shut us out. Is that what you want?" That was the fatal blow. The thought of the chasm between them becoming a permanent, uncrossable canyon terrified Eleanor more than any financial loss. For years, her entire identity had been wrapped up in being Amelia's mother. To lose that connection was to lose herself. Her daughter was asking for a show of faith, and Eleanor knew with a sinking heart that she could not deny her. Her practical wisdom, her hard-earned caution, all of it dissolved in the face of her overwhelming love and fear. Her hand trembled as she took the pen Amelia offered. The documents were complex, filled with legal clauses she couldn't comprehend, but she wasn't reading them. She was looking at her daughter's hopeful, pleading face. She signed where Amelia pointed, her signature, once a mark of her own sturdy independence, now an act of complete and total surrender. Amelia's relief was immediate and palpable. She hugged her mother tightly, a gesture that felt both triumphant and dismissive. "You won't regret this, Mom. This is the beginning of everything for us." She gathered her things, gave her mother a quick kiss on the cheek, and left, promising to call with updates. As Eleanor watched the town car pull away from the curb, a profound silence descended on the small apartment. She looked at the duplicate copies of the papers on her table, a testament to her folly. The glossy image of the non-existent towers seemed to mock her. A cold dread, heavy and certain, settled in her stomach. She hadn't just signed away her life savings. She had a terrible feeling she had just paid the final installment on a transaction that had cost her a daughter. The transfer of funds was a silent, sterile affair. A number disappeared from Eleanor's modest bank account and reappeared in the vast, labyrinthine finances of the Declare Corporation. For Amelia, it was a problem solved, a box checked. For Eleanor, it was an act of faith, and in the weeks that followed, she clung to the hope that her faith would be rewarded, not with financial returns, but with a renewed connection to her daughter. She was wrong. The calls became even less frequent, the excuses more elaborate. The chasm did not close, it widened, and the silence on the other end of the line grew colder and deeper. The final test, the one that would permanently seal the door between their two worlds, was set for the night of the annual Starlight Benefit, the crown jewel of New York's philanthropic calendar, an event chaired, of course, by Beatrice de Clare. Hours before the gala, Amelia stood before a three-way mirror in her dressing room, a shimmering column of silver chiffon. She was the picture of perfection, yet her reflection showed a woman haunted by a deep, anxious tremor. Beatrice entered the room without knocking, a silent wraith in black silk. She adjusted a stray strand of Amelia's hair, her touch as cold as a serpent's skin. "You look beautiful, my dear," she said, her eyes meeting Amelia's in the mirror. "A true de Clare." She paused, letting the compliment land before delivering the poisoned dart. "I received a message from the event staff. It seems your mother has been inquiring about the evening's arrangements. I trust you've made the situation clear to her?" Amelia's stomach plummeted. "She wouldn't just show up, Beatrice. She knows it's a private event." Beatrice's smile was thin and razor-sharp. "Hope is a tenacious weed, Amelia. Sometimes one must be firm in their gardening." She placed her hands on Amelia's shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. "Tonight, many of our most important associates will be present. Our name, our reputation, is everything. There can be no confusion about who you are or where you come from. There is the world that made you, and there is the world that you now belong to. You cannot live in both. Tonight, should the situation arise, you will choose. It is her, Amelia, or it is us, and all that comes with us." Meanwhile, in her small apartment in Queens, Eleanor Vance was not thinking of galas or high society. She was thinking about the weather report. A nasty autumn storm was predicted to roll in after midnight, bringing with it a biting wind and chilling rain. Her gaze fell upon a beautiful pashmina shawl, a cascade of soft cashmere in a deep shade of blue, draped over her armchair. Amelia had bought it for her the previous Christmas, the last truly personal gift she had received. But Eleanor, knowing its exorbitant price, had insisted it was too fine for her simple life and had given it back, telling Amelia to wear it on special occasions. She knew Amelia loved it, but she also knew how forgetful her daughter could be when she was in a rush. A simple, nagging, motherly worry took hold. She imagined Amelia leaving the warm hotel, shivering in her beautiful gown. It was a foolish impulse, born of a lifetime of caretaking. She would just drop it off with the concierge. She wouldn't intrude. She would leave a little note. "Don't catch a cold. Love, Mom." Dressed in her simple navy sheath, clutching the shawl wrapped in tissue paper, Eleanor felt a wave of anxiety as she entered the opulent lobby of the Pierre. The sheer scale of the wealth on display was dizzying. Feeling too intimidated to approach the imperious-looking concierge, she saw guests being directed towards the grand ballroom and thought she might be able to find a staff member inside to help. One step into the magnificent room, and she was frozen. It was a fantasy world of shimmering gowns, sparkling jewels, and the confident laughter of people who owned the world. And then she saw her. Amelia, her daughter, looking more beautiful than she ever had, a silver goddess bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers. A surge of pure, unadulterated love, so powerful it eclipsed her anxiety, propelled Eleanor forward. She just wanted to see her up close, to drink in the sight of her beautiful, successful child. She was completely unaware that she was a lamb walking into a carefully prepared slaughter. She navigated the glittering crowd, her heart thumping, the pashmina clutched in her hand like a talisman. As she drew near, she saw Beatrice's eyes lock onto her, a flicker of cold, reptilian triumph in their depths. She saw Julian shift uncomfortably, his pleasant smile tightening at the edges, but she only had eyes for her daughter. "Amelia, darling," she called out softly, her voice filled with a nervous warmth. The small circle of conversation stopped. Time itself seemed to slow down. Amelia turned, and for a heart-stopping second, Eleanor saw her daughter's true face. She saw a flash of panic, of shock, of a deep, buried pain. It was the face of the little girl who used to run to her after a nightmare. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. A shutter slammed down, and her expression became one of cool, detached appraisal. The stranger was back. Amelia looked past her mother, towards the influential couple they were speaking with, and offered a small apologetic laugh. "I'm so sorry for the interruption," she said, her voice a melody of polite dismissal. She then turned her gaze upon Eleanor, a woman who had given her life, who had sacrificed everything for her happiness, and delivered the final, fatal blow. "I'm not sure who this woman is. Perhaps she's lost." The words didn't just hang in the air, they detonated. For Eleanor, the sound of the string quartet vanished, replaced by a deafening, high-pitched ringing in her ears. The warmth of the room turned to ice. She felt the blood drain from her face, a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the marble floor had dropped away beneath her feet. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was an execution. She looked into her daughter's eyes, desperately searching for a flicker of remorse, a hint of a joke, anything. She found nothing. Only the cold, hard reflection of the ballroom lights in the eyes of a stranger who wore her daughter's face. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of glass twisting in her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The money, she realized with a sickening clarity, was never an investment. It was her severance package, the price of her own erasure. She had been bought out of her own daughter's life, and now she was being publicly discarded. She didn't say a word. There were no words left. She simply turned, the tissue-wrapped shawl still in her hand, and began the long, lonely walk out of the ballroom. She could feel the stares of the crowd on her back, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was no longer a person. She was just a story they would whisper about tomorrow. The heavy doors closed behind her, shutting out the light, the music, and the last vestiges of the life she had known, leaving her alone in the cold, echoing hallway, utterly and completely destroyed. The moment Eleanor left that gilded ballroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a sound like a final judgment, the vibrant noise of the charity gala faded into a chilling, absolute silence. She didn't weep. The shock was too profound, the betrayal too surgical. Amelia's words, "I don't know this woman," weren't just a denial. They were an execution. They killed the mother, the protector, the sole provider who had defined herself by that one unbreakable bond. Eleanor's descent was swift, stark, and utterly humiliating. She had handed over the entirety of her life savings, every last hard-earned dollar meant for her modest retirement and medical security, to her daughter. That money was now a phantom, dissolved into the DeClaire family's opulent lifestyle. The investment opportunity, the sweet lie spun by Julian and Amelia, was a vacuum that had sucked the financial foundation right out from under her. Her small, comfortable apartment, the one she had filled with the scent of cheap detergent and the sound of Amelia practicing the piano, was the first casualty. Unable to make the mortgage payments, she lost it. She found herself in the grimmest corner of the city, a tiny, dilapidated room with peeling paint and a window that overlooked a perpetually greasy alleyway. The air was heavy with the smell of stale cooking oil and despair. This was her new reality, a widow in her late 50s with no savings, no home, and worst of all, no child. She was, quite literally, back to zero. Eleanor, whose hands knew only honest work, took on the heaviest, most grueling jobs she could find. She worked multiple shifts, washing dishes in a dive bar until 2 a.m., then catching a few hours of sleep before rising at dawn to clean factory floors. Her back ached constantly, her knees swelled, and the calluses on her hands deepened, a silent, painful ledger of her new poverty. The physical agony was immense, yet it was a welcome distraction from the searing, emotional pain. The cruelest irony lay just a few miles away, flaunted across every social media platform. While Eleanor was scrubbing industrial grime, Amelia DeClaire was curating a perfect life. There were sun-drenched photos of European vacations. Amelia, in a designer dress in front of the Eiffel Tower, Julian beside her, handsome and detached. There were dazzling images of lavish dinner parties where Amelia, draped in diamonds that were perhaps bought with Eleanor's life savings, laughed with the elite. She was the quintessential society darling, radiant and utterly oblivious to the mother she had reduced to a ghost. Eleanor tried, initially. The love of a mother is not a switch that can simply be turned off. She sent text messages pleading, then questioning, then simply asking if Amelia was well. Every message was met with silence. Once, driven by desperation, she went to the magnificent DeClaire estate, a sprawling fortress of wealth and cold stone. She was intercepted by a security guard before she even reached the iron gates, treated like a vagrant and coldly told that Mrs. DeClaire had issued strict instructions. Eleanor was never to return. The finality of that moment, the realization that her own daughter had erected walls of stone and contempt between them, shattered the last fragments of Eleanor's hope. She fell into a deep, consuming depression. The silence of her tiny room was deafening, the solitude crushing. She would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, the memories of Amelia's childhood, the small triumphs, the whispered secrets, the promises flashing like tormenting cinema reels. Where did I go wrong? She would ask the darkness. Did I love her too much? Did I teach her nothing of loyalty? It was in this dark, silent pit of despair that the subtle shift began. The tears, which had refused to fall in public, finally ran dry. The paralyzing grief started to curdle into something harder, colder, and far more potent. Eleanor realized that her weeping was a luxury she could no longer afford, an indulgence that kept her tethered to the past and the pain. One morning, after a night spent staring blankly at the ceiling, Eleanor dragged herself out of bed. She looked at her reflection, gaunt, tired, eyes hollowed out by sorrow, and saw not a victim, but a survivor who was choosing to die. It was a moment of profound clarity. The people who had done this to her Amelia, Julian, and the formidable Beatrice DeClaire were not worth the ultimate sacrifice of her own sanity and life. They had stripped her of her assets, her home, and her daughter's presence, but they could not take her spirit unless she surrendered it. The silence that had been her prison now became her sanctuary. She stopped talking about Amelia. She stopped watching the society pages. She began to focus all her immense, pent-up energy, the energy that had once fueled her endless work for her daughter, into a single, quiet purpose: rebuilding. Her deep grief began to transmute into a steely, quiet resilience. The searing heat of betrayal had not incinerated her, it had forged her into something unbreakable. Eleanor's silence was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of a clock being meticulously wound, the quiet counting down before an inevitable striking. She knew she couldn't fight them with their own weapons, money, lawyers, and social standing. They were too entrenched. But she had something they lacked: the integrity and work ethic she had honed over a lifetime. She decided her strength would be her anonymity, her quiet competence, and her ability to observe the corrupt, glittering world from the shadows they had relegated her to. The process of transformation was slow and internal. The pain of her loss was still a dull ache, but now it was channeled. It was the energy she used to scrub harder, to work longer, to save every penny. She realized that the only true power in this world lay not in inherited wealth, but in self-reliance. This was the beginning of her silent war. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no public scenes. Eleanor Vance, the discarded mother, would simply, quietly, and inexorably rise. And she would wait for the inevitable moment when the golden facade of the DeClaire empire, built on lies and stolen money, would finally crack under its own immense weight. She needed no revenge. She simply needed to be ready when karma, in its own slow, devastating way, finally came calling for her daughter and her cruel, wealthy in-laws. Her silence was not a surrender. It was a promise of a reckoning. Eleanor's quiet resolve was the anchor holding her steady, but sheer willpower could not overcome the forces arrayed against her. She was a single, financially decimated woman, up against a sprawling, powerful financial empire. She was a cleaner, and they were the masters of the universe, or so they appeared. Yet, the universe has a strange way of bringing the pieces together when a debt is owed, a balance that must be restored. She was working a shift at a high-end commercial building in Midtown, a place where fortunes were made and, as she was about to learn, where they were also systematically destroyed. Her company was one woman, herself, and her mop and bucket. This particular office belonged to a boutique financial litigation firm. It was late, the kind of quiet hour when only the most driven or those burdened by relentless anxiety remained. Eleanor was methodically polishing a mahogany desk when she heard a low cough from the corner office. A man emerged, wearing a rumpled, expensive suit and an expression of deep fatigue. His eyes, though tired, were sharp and penetrating. He stopped abruptly, looking at Eleanor's back. "Eleanor? Eleanor Vance?" She turned, startled. The name sounded foreign, formal, dredged up from a lifetime ago. The man stepped into the light, and a flicker of memory ignited in the cavern of her sorrow. "David?" she whispered, the name of her late husband's best friend. "David Chen?" David Chen was not just a friend. He was a man who had left the city decades ago after a devastating stock market crash, only to return as a formidable, highly respected forensic financial investigator. He specialized in dissecting corporate fraud and unraveling the most complex white-collar crimes. The reunion, under such profoundly unequal circumstances, was steeped in silent awkwardness. David looked at her at the weariness etched around her eyes, at the heavy-duty gloves she wore, at the uniform that marked her station. He knew Eleanor from a past life, a life of modest happiness before her husband's early death, a life where her biggest worry was getting Amelia into a good school. "My God, Eleanor, what happened?" he asked, his voice low, his expression instantly empathetic. He ushered her into his office, ignoring the trail of cleaning solution. Eleanor, who had refused to tell her story to anyone, suddenly found the words spilling out: the sudden, lavish wedding, the persuasive talk of investment, the total surrender of her life savings, and the ultimate, brutal denial at the gala. She recounted the pain with a quiet, detached calm that made her story all the more chilling. She didn't cry. The time for tears was over. David listened, his sharp eyes fixed on her. As she spoke about the Declare Group and their guaranteed returns on a prime Manhattan real estate development, a professional alarm bell went off in his mind. He didn't need to check the public records. The pattern was too familiar, the promises too inflated. "Eleanor," he said, leaning back, his tone grave, "I'm going to be straight with you. I know the Declare name. They're old money, yes, but they've been living on borrowed time and leveraging paper assets for years. The investment they coerced out of you, I suspect it doesn't exist. Not in the way they described it." He explained the mechanics of what he believed was happening. The Declare Group, under Beatrice's tyrannical management and Julian's reckless spending, was likely operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. They weren't building towers. They were simply using new investors' money, like Eleanor's life savings, to pay off the interest promised to older investors, all while funding their extravagant lifestyle. It was a golden facade, waiting for the structural integrity to fail. "Your money, Eleanor, it didn't go into concrete and steel. It went into diamonds, private jets, and that ridiculous gala your daughter was at," David stated, his anger visible. "They didn't just use you. They saw you as easy money, the trusting, working-class mother who would believe her own child. It's predatory, it's criminal, and it's textbook financial fraud." David immediately offered to help. "We can hit them hard. We can file a civil suit for fraud and unjust enrichment, and I can alert the proper authorities, the SEC, maybe even the FBI, given the scale. We can get your money back, Eleanor. We can ruin them." The proposal hung in the air, a lifeline made of legal steel. For a few agonizing minutes, Eleanor contemplated the sweet justice of seeing Beatrice Declare's empire crumble in court, of watching Julian face the kind of legal scrutiny he deserved. She thought of her daughter, Amelia, standing humiliated on the witness stand. But a strange calm settled over her. Revenge was a hungry, loud beast, and Eleanor was finished with noise. She had learned the hard lesson that joining the fray only dirties one's own hands. She looked past the financial retribution David offered. and saw a deeper, more profound justice. "No, David," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, surprising even herself. "No lawsuit. Not yet. I don't want their money back. I don't want the notoriety. I want justice, not a financial settlement." David was stunned. "Eleanor, that money is your retirement. This is your chance to recover everything." "And what then?" she countered, looking at him with the unflinching gaze of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I'll have the money, but Amelia will still be married to a thief, controlled by a monster, living a life built on a ticking time bomb. They stole my money, yes, but they used that money to build a prison for my daughter, a golden cage. A lawsuit would only force Amelia to choose her side publicly, and I know which side she's been trained to pick." Eleanor explained her philosophy, forged in the depths of her despair. "I want the whole thing to come down on its own. I want the world they've built on lies to collapse from the inside. They don't deserve the dignity of being sued by me. They deserve to self-destruct. And when they do, David, they won't just lose their money. They'll lose their reputation, their freedom, and their sanity." She had a different kind of plan. It was silent. It was patient. It was built on the terrifying certainty of karma. "You told me that whole scheme is a house of cards," Eleanor continued, her eyes now gleaming with a cold, clear light. "It will fall. It's a matter of when, not if. If I sue now, I'll just be a creditor, trying to get a slice of a dissolving pie. If I wait and stay silent, I become an untainted observer. The final reckoning." Eleanor then made her request. She didn't want his money or his legal representation. She wanted his expertise. "David, I need you to promise me something. Keep investigating the Declare group silently. Track their investors. Find out how close they are to the precipice. And when you know the collapse is imminent, when the authorities are about to move in, when the house is about to fall, you tell me. That is all I need. I need the truth, and I need the timing." She was choosing to fight the most powerful family in the city by simply stepping out of their way and waiting for them to trip over their own corruption. It was a strategy born of deep wisdom and profound personal pain. David Chen, a veteran of countless high-stakes legal battles, looked at the woman before him. He saw not the cleaning lady, but a mother whose capacity for calculated, quiet sacrifice was terrifyingly immense. He saw the true nature of Eleanor's justice. It was not about personal revenge, but about redemption for herself, by rebuilding her life, and perhaps, eventually, for her misguided daughter, by destroying the corrupt world she had bought into. He stood up, extended his hand, not as a lawyer but as a friend and an ally. "Eleanor, you've changed. This silence, it's formidable. You have my word. I will be your eyes and ears in that world. I'll track the fall. And when the time is right, I'll come to you." Eleanor shook his hand. In that simple, quiet pact, her path was set. She would not rely on the legal system, nor on the kindness of strangers. She would rely on two things: her own hard work and the inevitable, crushing weight of the truth. She left David's office that night, not as a victim leaving her place of work, but as a general, having secured her most valuable intelligence asset, ready to begin the long, silent work of building her own kingdom from the ashes of her old life. She was ready to rise. Eleanor Vance stood at a pivotal juncture. She had refused the loud, quick justice of a lawsuit, opting instead for the silent, comprehensive reckoning she knew the Declares deserved. Her choice was not fueled by cowardice, but by the ultimate clarity born of having lost everything. She was going to fight the world of inherited luxury and systemic deceit, not with money she didn't have, but with the one thing they scorned: honest, relentless labor. David Chen, her unlikely ally, provided the strategic counsel, but the actual rebuilding was solely Eleanor's work. She politely declined his offer of a personal loan. She had learned a crippling lesson. She would never again depend on the perceived generosity of others, especially those who measured worth in dollars. Her new empire, however humble, would be built entirely on her own sweat and integrity. With the few $100s she had managed to save from her grueling initial jobs and the strategic advice from David, Eleanor began to lay the foundation of her new life. She didn't buy a lottery ticket. She bought a few buckets, specialized cleaning solutions, and a simple, professional uniform. She created a business card that was understated, elegant, and bore a name that signaled her new purpose: Vance Premier Cleaning. Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, a direct response to the world that had cast her out. She knew the elite of New York. She had worked in their kitchens, scrubbed their marble floors, and changed their bed linens. She understood their deepest need: discretion and impeccable quality. The wealthy didn't just want clean homes, they wanted silent service. They wanted people in their private spaces who were professional enough to see everything: the hidden bottles of liquor, the tense arguments, the evidence of infidelity, the precarious finances, but loyal enough to say nothing. They wanted a cleaner they could trust more than their staff. Eleanor marketed her company directly to this niche. Her pitch was never about price. It was about trust, meticulousness, and absolute silence. She herself conducted the initial consultations, and her demeanor, calm, professional, and radiating an almost ascetic self-possession, won over the skeptical socialites. They saw her quiet dignity and mistook it for the humility of a good servant, never realizing it was the controlled power of a woman who had nothing left to fear. She focused on quality over volume. She charged a premium, reflecting the unparalleled attention to detail and the promise of a complete, signed, non-disclosure agreement, NDA, for every client. She didn't hire a large staff. She personally trained a small, hand-picked crew of older women, fellow survivors of life's betrayals, who shared her commitment to hard work and discretion. Vance Premier Cleaning flourished, not quickly, but steadily and surely. Word of mouth spread among the city's wealthiest, the highest praise being the quietest. Eleanor Vance's team is exceptional. They are ghosts. You never know they've been there until everything shines. Eleanor worked alongside her team, putting in hours that would crush a younger person. She wasn't just managing, she was setting the standard. She could clean a 6,000 square foot penthouse in the Upper East Side faster and better than anyone. Her body still ached, but now the pain was different. It was the honest ache of accomplishment, not the hollow ache of grief. The financial recovery was slow but substantial. Every penny was earned, clean, and entirely her own. She reinvested wisely, guided by the ethical counsel of David Chen. She wasn't building a gilded cage. She was building a Fao Dai, a fortress of financial stability and self-worth. Within 2 years, she was able to move out of the dismal room in the alley. Her new apartment was still modest compared to the Declare estate, but it was pristine, sunlit, and paid for outright. Every piece of furniture, every appliance, felt heavy with the weight of her sacrifice and triumph. She had built this, not Julian, not Beatrice, and certainly not Amelia. She became a fixture in the periphery of the elite world. She was the quiet woman who cleaned the private offices of hedge fund managers, the penthouses of socialites, and the executive suites of rival firms. In these privileged spaces, she was invisible, yet she saw everything. She heard the whispered conversations about declining portfolio values, the frantic phone calls about investigations, and the nervous chatter about the Declare Group's increasing instability. Eleanor's new life was a testament to her philosophy. True wealth is portable and self-generated. She had replaced the false promise of inherited luxury with the unassailable truth of merit. She had lost her daughter's heart to gold, and in response, she was using her own 2 hands to refine her soul. Her success was the ultimate act of quiet defiance. While Amelia was living a lie built on the thin ice of her in-laws' corruption, Eleanor was building her life on bedrock. She knew that the contrast between them would one day be the final, crushing blow. Amelia was soaring on the fumes of an unsustainable illusion. Eleanor was rising on the solid wings of reality. The silence that had initially been her emotional coffin was now her greatest asset. She never spoke of Amelia or the Declares. When clients asked about her background, she simply smiled and said, "I decided to build something new." The mystery only enhanced her aura of professionalism. Eleanor was now a woman transformed. She had the eyes of a strategist, the spine of a queen, and the calloused hands of a survivor. She was ready. Ready for the market to correct itself, ready for the law to take its course, and ready for the moment David Chen would call to tell her the storm was finally arriving. Her redemption would not be served by a lawyer's brief, but by the simple, brutal arithmetic of inevitable failure. She had escaped the fire. Now she was waiting for the house to burn down, knowing her lost child was still trapped inside. While Eleanor Vance was quietly laying the foundation of her new, honest life, the glittering structure of the DeClaire empire, which had scorned and exploited her, was beginning its inevitable, agonizing collapse. The Ponzi scheme, like a magnificent machine fueled by stolen capital and inflated promises, was running out of steam. In the rarefied circles of Manhattan's ultra-rich, the first signs of trouble are never loud. They are subtle shifts in atmosphere, a nervous tightening around the eyes during market discussions, and the sudden, chilling disappearance of certain high-flying figures. For the DeClaire Group, the tremors began with an unwelcome financial reality. The flow of new, naive investors, the lifeblood of their fraud, was drying up. The promised guaranteed 15% returns that Julian and Beatrice had been touting were becoming harder and harder to deliver using only paper wealth. The immediate consequence of this fiscal strain was a precipitous drop in cash flow, forcing the DeClaires to liquidate non-essential assets in increasingly desperate, secretive ways. The family jet was grounded, ostensibly for maintenance. The lavish parties became fewer, smaller, and less frequent, with Beatrice citing a sudden, profound interest in exclusivity. But the truth whispered louder than any lie. The money was running out. Inside the DeClaire mansion, the gilded cage that Amelia had so eagerly entered was fast becoming a claustrophobic prison. Julian, who had been charmingly careless, became pathologically irritable. The pressure from creditors and increasingly demanding investors who hadn't seen a return in months transformed him into a man riddled with anxiety and deep resentment. He stopped taking Amelia on the extravagant European trips. Now, their travels were limited to rushed, tense meetings with stressed lawyers and accountants. The glamorous facade of their marriage shattered, exposing the cold, transactional nature of their union. Julian's charm was merely the veneer of his entitlement. Stripped of financial security, he was nothing but an angry, frightened boy. The domestic tension escalated into ugly, frequent fights, fought behind the soundproof walls of their master suite. Julian's temper, once merely controlled, now flared into verbal abuse, often directed squarely at Amelia. He blamed her for his stress, for their bad luck, and even, in one chilling outburst, for her poor bloodline, which he claimed was bringing down the DeClaire name. Amelia, the woman who had publicly denied her own mother to secure this life, found herself living in a permanent state of dread. She was surrounded by wealth, priceless art, designer clothes, and servants, yet she was emotionally and physically isolated. Her friends, the very socialites who had fawned over her during the good times, sensing the toxic aroma of financial distress, began to distance themselves. They were the rats leaving a sinking, albeit gilded, ship. The true monster in the house, however, was Beatrice DeClaire. The matriarch's tyranny, previously disguised as maternal guidance, now became vicious. To Beatrice, the collapse was unimaginable, an affront to her dynasty. And like any despot, she needed a scapegoat. That scapegoat was Amelia. Beatrice began a relentless campaign of psychological cruelty. She would coldly remind Amelia that she was a charity case, a zero-worth commodity who had only been accepted into the family to serve as a beautiful, pliable wife for Julian. She accused Amelia of distracting Julian, of being too demanding, and, most painfully, she repeatedly suggested that Amelia's poor, low-born energy was the jinx that had brought financial ruin to the great DeClaire name. The culmination of Amelia's private suffering arrived when she discovered she was pregnant. Instead of joy, the news brought a wave of paralyzing fear. This child would not be born into a loving, stable home. It would be born into a war zone, destined to be used as a pawn by its toxic grandmother and its volatile father. When Amelia cautiously told Julian the news, his reaction was not happiness, but a furious, cold silence, followed by a terrifying interrogation about the added financial burden and the interruption to his already crushing schedule. Beatrice, upon hearing the news, dismissed it with a wave of her hand, simply stating, "Well, try not to be too fat for the creditors when they arrive." Amelia was forced to confront the brutal truth. She was not a treasured daughter-in-law, not a partner, and certainly not an heir. She was a decorative asset, now severely devalued, trapped in a loveless marriage with a rapidly unraveling husband, under the watchful, hateful eye of a woman who viewed her as less than the dust on the imported marble floor. The gilded cage had fully transformed into a lethal trap. It was in this suffocating isolation that the memory of her mother, Eleanor, began to surface, not the embarrassing working-class figure she had publicly denied, but the Eleanor of her childhood, the woman whose hands were rough but whose embrace was a sanctuary. The memory was sharp, painful, and laced with profound shame. She had betrayed the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally for a temporary illusion of wealth that was now crumbling around her ears. Amelia had successfully distanced herself from the poverty she once feared, only to find herself far poorer in spirit and safety than she had ever been. She had traded a small, honest life for a grand, terrible lie. As the tension in the DeClaire mansion escalated, punctuated by Julian's angry outbursts and Beatrice's chilling contempt, Amelia realized with a dawning horror that she was truly, utterly alone. The cracks in the golden facade were widening, revealing the rot beneath, and soon the whole structure would come down, threatening to bury her and her unborn child in its wreckage. And the only person who might, just might, be capable of saving her was the woman she had looked in the eye and coldly disowned. The quiet, tense stability inside the DeClaire mansion was, as Eleanor had predicted, merely the horrifying stillness before the hurricane. For months, David Chen had been watching, tracking the debt-to-equity ratios and the panicked movements of their high-profile investors. He saw the inevitable coming. The DeClaire Group's Ponzi scheme had finally reached its mathematical tipping point. There were not enough new lies to pay for the old ones. The collapse began not with a bang, but with a series of legal notices delivered on a crisp Tuesday morning. The kind of morning Julian and Beatrice had always imagined was reserved for celebratory headlines. Instead, the headlines screamed the truth. An emergency injunction was filed by a consortium of major banks and increasingly agitated institutional investors. They had sniffed out the fraud and were moving to protect what little capital they could salvage. The immediate effect was catastrophic. The DeClaire Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, a preliminary step that would soon expose the deep, criminal rot at its core. The news hit the Manhattan social circuit like a seismic shockwave. The financial world watched in stunned silence as the venerable name of DeClaire, a seemingly eternal symbol of inherited wealth, crumbled in hours. The real storm broke precisely 48 hours later. It was just after dawn. Amelia, exhausted and fearful after another sleepless night spent worrying about the future of her unborn child, was jolted awake, not by Julian, but by the insistent, chilling sound of heavy, unfamiliar boots on the imported marble of the main staircase. She stumbled out of bed, just as a team of FBI agents and financial investigators, armed with warrants and grim expressions, swept into the master suite. The air filled with the rapid, clipped language of law enforcement. Federal agents, freeze. Put your hands where we can see them. Julian DeClaire, who had spent his life believing he was untouchable, was found cowering in the ensuite dressing room, clutching a depleted offshore bank ledger. He didn't resist. The reality of his failure and the scope of his deceit had already broken him. Beatrice DeClaire, in contrast, reacted with the furious, cold rage of a monarch being deposed. She emerged from her private study, clad in a silk robe, shouting about the indignity, the mistake, and the old family name. Her indignant roar was met with professional indifference. A female agent calmly read her the charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud, all related to a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme disguised as a real estate investment portfolio. The spectacular public arrest of the matriarch and the heir was the city's top story for weeks. Television cameras captured the grim procession as Julian and Beatrice, looking haggard and utterly stripped of their arrogance, were led out of their front door and into unmarked cars. The consequences were immediate and ruthless. All DeClaire assets, the mansion, the art collection, the family foundation accounts, were frozen and seized by the government. The golden cage had not only fallen, but had been padlocked shut. Amelia was left standing in the ruins. She was not arrested. Her involvement in the fraud was deemed peripheral. She was a willing pawn, but not a primary conspirator. She watched the FBI agents seal off the mansion, labeling every piece of art and furniture as government property. She was given 2 hours to gather her personal belongings before being escorted off the premises. She left the mansion with a single suitcase, carrying a handful of designer clothes, a few pieces of jewelry, and the profound, crushing realization that she had given up her life for nothing but an illusion. She was pregnant, unemployed, and financially destitute. The friends she had made in that world vanished faster than the morning mist. Her calls were unanswered. Her texts were met with automatic new number, "Who dis?" replies. The final, bitter dose of poison came later that day. Julian, desperate and cornered during his initial interrogation, had attempted to cut a deal by offering a full confession, not just about the scheme's mechanics, but about its victims. He detailed the use of shell corporations, the illicit flow of funds, and, crucially, the calculated decision to lure Eleanor Vance into the scam. He spoke about Eleanor's savings with a terrifying lack of remorse, viewing her investment as merely a small, necessary transaction. When the federal agent pressed him on his motivation for targeting his own mother-in-law, Julian, defeated and emotionally vacant, uttered a confession that revealed the depths of his cold cynicism. She was an easy mark. Amelia said her mother was gullible and desperately wanted to help her rich family. We needed the cash for an overdue payment on Beatrice's yacht. It was a perfect, low-risk extraction. Besides, I never loved Amelia. She was just the pretty package, the society cover story. A wife who knew her place and was easy to control. Her mother's money just sweetened the deal. This chilling statement, recorded by federal investigators, stripped away the very last shred of dignity and self-justification Amelia might have clung to. She hadn't been loved, even for her beauty or intelligence. She had been used, and her mother had been a necessary casualty. Julian's cold words confirmed what Eleanor had quietly known all along. The Declares were vultures, and Amelia, through her ambition, had simply made herself and her mother vulnerable prey. Amelia found herself on the sidewalk, watching the heavy iron gates of the Declare mansion close, the cold weight of the security seal a final, mocking goodbye. She had the clothes, but she had lost her name, her status, and her future. The world of gold and power had rejected her utterly. All the choices she had made, every painful denial of her true self and her mother, had led her to this single, devastating point: absolute, utter destitution and isolation. She had nowhere to go, no one to call, and no one left in the world who even pretended to care. The golden cage had vaporized, leaving her alone on the hard, cold pavement of a city that only respects success. In her despair, the only beacon of genuine, unconditional love she could recall was the face of the woman she had looked in the eye and betrayed. The storm had arrived, and Amelia was lost at sea. The fall was complete. Amelia Declare, now simply Amelia Vance again, stood on the unfamiliar sidewalk outside the Declare mansion, the single suitcase at her feet, mocking the emptiness of her life. She was a ghost in the city she had conquered, a pregnant woman with no resources, no credit, and a name tainted by scandal. Every phone number she tried was dead or went straight to voicemail. The friends who had toasted her success were now frantically deleting all photographic evidence of their association with the Declare dynasty. In her desperation, her mind turned to the only sanctuary she had ever known: the small, warm apartment where she had grown up. Driven by a primal urge for home, she took the subway, an indignity she hadn't suffered in years, to her old neighborhood. The building stood, but a cold realization hit her. She had allowed her mother to lose it. The apartment was occupied by strangers. Standing outside the familiar brownstone, staring at the cheerful curtains she didn't recognize, the utter finality of her betrayal crashed down. She had not only lost her own future, but had actively destroyed her mother's past. With nowhere left to turn, and the icy dread of being utterly alone in a city of millions, Amelia remembered the address David Chen had once mentioned, the one linked to her mother's quiet new endeavor. It was a business address, a place she hadn't dared to visit, a place of honest labor that she had grown to despise. She found the building in a respectable, though far from elite, commercial district. It was a modern, glass-fronted office complex. She stood outside, the glare from the window reflecting her gaunt, defeated face. The lobby directory listed the tenant, Vance Premier Cleaning, Suite 402. Amelia took the elevator up, the metallic ping of its arrival sounding like a drum roll to her own judgment. She stepped out onto the 4th floor and saw the company name displayed in simple, elegant lettering on a frosted glass door. It was neat, professional, and radiating the kind of quiet, legitimate success that the declares had only ever faked. She pushed the door open. The office was modestly furnished, but immaculate. Everything shone with a polish that spoke of Eleanor's meticulous standards. A woman sat at the reception desk, and through an inner glass partition, Amelia saw her. Eleanor Vance. The woman on the other side of the glass was not the weary, stooped cleaner Amelia had publicly disowned. This Eleanor was poised, perfectly dressed in a smart, tailored business suit that hinted at quiet authority. She was standing over a blueprint on a large table, speaking calmly and confidently to 2 uniformed employees. Her hair was neatly styled, and though the lines of worry were still etched around her eyes, they were now offset by a look of unassailable self-possession. She looked like a woman who had fought a war and won, not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a general. She was a successful small business owner, built from the ashes of betrayal, forged by the very fire that had consumed her daughter. The contrast was a physical blow. Amelia, pregnant, wearing a wrinkled, once expensive dress that now looked cheap, clutching a battered suitcase, was the picture of collapse. Eleanor, the mother she had abandoned, was the picture of resilience. It was the sight of her mother's hands, no longer calloused from endless, thankless labor, but holding a professional stylus and pointing decisively at the architectural drawing that finally broke Amelia. The magnitude of her mother's achievement, built entirely on integrity while Amelia's life had been built on stolen money, was overwhelming. Eleanor finished her instruction, nodded dismissively to her staff, and turned toward the reception area. Her eyes met Amelia's. There was no sudden anger, no rush of vengeful satisfaction in Eleanor's gaze. There was only an immense, bottomless sorrow. It was the look of a person who watches the inevitable tragedy they predicted unfold, feeling only the pain of the lost potential. Amelia's legs gave way. Her carefully constructed, diamond-encrusted shell cracked completely, and she collapsed onto her knees, dropping the suitcase with a muffled thud that echoed in the quiet office. "Mom," she choked out, the word barely a whisper, thick with shame and desperation. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I have nowhere to go." The elegant, professional woman who had just been commanding a business meeting was gone, replaced instantly by the ancient, instinctive core of motherhood. Eleanor crossed the room quickly, but without haste. She didn't deliver the scathing words of judgment Amelia deserved and expected. She didn't remind her of the gala, the denial, or the stolen life savings. Those words were unnecessary. The wreckage of Amelia's life was testament enough. She simply knelt down on the clean floor, oblivious to the expensive suit, and gently took her daughter's face in her hands. "Get up, Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady, not hard, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a new, profound boundary. "You don't beg, you stand. Come inside." She helped her daughter to her feet, a reversal of roles from the life they had just lived, and led the weeping, broken woman through the partition, past the curious eyes of the receptionist, and into her private office. Amelia collapsed onto a leather chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I lost everything, Mom. Julian, he never loved me. He told the FBI. It was all a lie. The money. You were right. You were right about everything. I'm pregnant, Mom, and I have nothing. I destroyed you for nothing." Eleanor sat behind her desk, watching her daughter, not with pity, but with a detached compassion. The mother's heart was bleeding, but the strategist's mind was clear. She waited for the storm of tears to subside. "Your father taught me something." "Amelia," Eleanor finally said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos. He said that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of it. But sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to realize the only thing that will hold you up is the foundation you build yourself. She looked at her daughter, at the hollow desperation in her eyes. You destroyed a part of me, yes. But you also destroyed the gold-plated illusion that was consuming you. The Declares have taken your money, your dignity, and your husband's freedom. They won't take your life, and they won't take this child's future. Eleanor did not offer immediate forgiveness. Forgiveness was a garden that required time and weeding. But she offered the one thing that mattered: a lifeline. I have an apartment, Eleanor said simply. It's clean, quiet, and secure. It's built on honest money. You'll go there tonight. You will rest. You will eat real food. We will talk about what comes next when you are strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet, not when you are on your knees. It was the final, devastating moment of the reckoning. Amelia was face to face with the woman she had scorned, a woman who had quietly achieved the true success that Amelia had pursued through fraud. Eleanor Vance was not just offering shelter, she was offering a chance at redemption, a chance that began not with a hug, but with the non-negotiable demand for self-respect. The prodigal daughter had returned, and the silence of the mother was finally broken, not by rage, but by an offer of a quiet, new beginning. Eleanor Vance watched her daughter, Amelia, sleep. She had settled her in the guest room of her new apartment, a space that smelled of fresh linen and true peace. It was a modest, third-floor unit, clean and quiet, paid for by the honest sweat that Amelia had once found so embarrassing. Looking at the frail, pregnant woman in the bed, stripped of her diamonds and her defiance, Eleanor felt the complex, overwhelming surge of a mother's emotion. It wasn't triumph. It was a deep, aching relief that the lie was over. The next morning, while Amelia was still lost in a weary slumber, the sound of the doorbell brought David Chen to the door. He was holding a worn file, his expression serious. He was not here to gloat, but to close the loop on Eleanor's extraordinary silent strategy. She's resting, Eleanor told him quietly, leading him into the small, sunlit kitchen. The Declare world is over. Julian and Beatrice are facing decades. What happens now? David opened the file, but his eyes were on Eleanor. The FBI is cleaning up. The assets are frozen. But Eleanor, I need to tell you something you need to understand fully. Something Amelia doesn't, and probably never will. He paused, then delivered the final, stunning piece of the puzzle. The ultimate twist that elevated Eleanor's ordeal from a simple story of revenge to a profound narrative of sacrifice. Your investment in the Declare scheme, David stated. I told you it was foolish, that you were an easy mark. That was what you wanted everyone to think. But when you asked me to track their financials, you gave me a specific instruction: track the point of no return. You knew what I was looking at. You knew they were bleeding dry. Eleanor simply nodded, her gaze calm. Eleanor, David continued, the admiration evident in his voice, that 20-year-old savings account was the last, uncorrupted cash injection the Declare Group received before their books completely collapsed. Julian and Beatrice were already circling bankruptcy. Your money, a relatively small but critical sum, wasn't their salvation. It was their accelerant. It temporarily stabilized them just long enough to draw the attention of the federal authorities, who were looking for patterns of new cash flowing into the dying Ponzi scheme. He laid out the financial reality. Eleanor's money was not an ignorant loss. It was a calculated lure. She had known the moment the Declare ship was about to sink, and she had deliberately given them the final piece of cargo they needed to ensure its spectacular, publicized destruction. You sacrificed your last security not because you were naive, but because you knew it was the only way to guarantee a total, irreversible collapse, David finished, shaking his head. If you had sued, they would have tied it up in court for years. If you had kept your money, they might have limped along, forcing Amelia to stay in that toxic world out of fear of public exposure. You didn't lose your money, Eleanor. You spent it on a one-way ticket for the FBI to shut down the Declare dynasty. Your justice wasn't revenge. It was an act of profound, strategic salvation. Eleanor closed the file with a quiet click. Her eyes were moist, But her voice was steady. Amelia's soul was being bought by them. She chose gold over the mother who loved her. The only way to save her was to take the gold away completely. I had to destroy the illusion so she could finally see the truth. That money was the price of my daughter's freedom. Her goal had not been to punish Amelia, but to destroy the corrupt environment that had warped her. She had endured the denial, the humiliation, and the poverty not out of victimhood, but as a silent warrior making the ultimate parental sacrifice. She had been the sword that cut the ropes of the golden cage, even if it meant temporarily plunging herself and her daughter into darkness. The sun was high when Amelia finally emerged, looking vulnerable and lost. She sat across from her mother, no longer defiant, but utterly broken. Forgiveness was still a long road ahead, but Eleanor offered the first step. "Don't ever look down on the silence of a person who has endured too much," Eleanor said, her voice resonating with a quiet authority that transcended the simple words. Because in that silence, they are not merely healing their wounds, they are meticulously constructing a fortress. And when the time for justice arrives, they won't need to fight, because the weight of your own choices, the weight of your own corruption, will become the force that destroys you. She looked directly at Amelia, her expression softening. The declares self-destructed. "Amelia, they fell because their foundation was lies, not because I pushed them. Your part now is to build something new, not on their promises, but on your own two hands. You have a chance, a clean slate, and a life to raise in truth." The story of Eleanor Vance is a stark reminder that the truest form of power is not found in public display or loud confrontation, but in quiet, deliberate resilience. She proved that betrayal, when met with unyielding strength and patience, can be transmuted into the foundation of a greater victory. Her justice was not the sweet, fleeting taste of revenge, but the hard-won, lasting redemption of a lost child and the quiet triumph of her own indestructible spirit. The two women sat in silence, the air heavy with the unsaid weight of the past and the fragile hope of the future. The clink of a teacup was the only sound. The life they were about to build would be defined by humility and labor, not luxury and deceit. It was an uncertain path, but it was real. And in Eleanor's arms, Amelia finally found the sanctuary she had so desperately sought, a sanctuary built not with gold, but with the unyielding, sacrificial love of a mother. Every family holds secrets, harbors its own private storms, and faces its moment of reckoning. Thank you for listening to the gripping story of the Vance family, a tale from the heart of US. Join us next time for another look into the dark, fascinating corners of the American family drama.